Welcome to the History Nerd United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to fanboy out a little bit today, people. Ben Macintyre, one of my favorite authors, finally got to talk to him. It was everything I hoped it'd be. He is one of the authors that I can tell you, just grab any book you see of his. They're all great, and you don't have to be a history nerd. He writes everything like it's a thriller. I don't know how to explain it. I don't know how he does it, but he does. And then I got to talk to him about his new book, The Siege, which I absolutely loved. I nerded out. I don't know what else to tell you. So how about I shut up and you just hear me make a fool out of myself, as per usual. Let's do it. And here we are with the author Ben Macintyre, The Siege, a 6-day hostage crisis and the daring special forces operation that shocked the world. Ben, thank you so much for coming on.
It's a great pleasure, Brendan. Thank you for having me.
As I've already said, I'm fanboying out a little bit. I could just go on, right? The Spy and the Traitor, Agent Zigzag, one of my personal favorites before this one, Prisoners of the Castle. And I just want to ask a general question before we jump into The Siege, because I was just telling my producer about this. You cover some very, very serious subjects, right? There's death, betrayal, all of these things. At least 3 or 4 times in every book I've ever read from you, I laugh out loud, which doesn't happen a lot in history. You seem to find humor even in the darkest places. Is this something that you go looking for to kind of just relieve some tension in your books, or do you just find it and you're like, that's got to go in there?
I think it is natural, strangely enough, for human beings, even in the most appalling circumstances, to find a kind of dark comedy, often as a way of getting themselves through what would otherwise be insupportable. You find humor in the strangest places. You find it in Stalinist Russia. You find it in the gulags. You even find it in concentration camps and death camps. People find solace, I think, in being able to laugh at humanity, even at its worst conceivable moment. And that was undoubtedly true of Colditz, the book you just referred to. This was an appalling prison. I mean, it was a really terrible place. It was freezing. There was not enough to eat. This was a prisoner of war camp. It was a horrible place. And yet there was a kind of internal comedy to the whole thing that kept everyone going. And I think it's one of the it's in a way, I think it's a sort of primal human reaction to disaster and dismay. There was even humor on 9/11 of a very black sort. I know that sounds so strange and counterintuitive, but I think it is one of the ways humans manage to create a kind of protective carapace in a strange way.
Now, as I just mentioned, a lot of the books we talked about, your Cold War, World War II. This is a bit different. What made you decide to tackle the Iranian Embassy siege in the UK?
I've always wanted to write about this. It's one of the key moments in 20th century history for me. I was a boy when this happened, and I was watching, believe it or not, Brendan, I was watching the snooker final, the World Cup final. Between Hurricane Higgins and a Canadian player. And it was coming down to the final, and suddenly they broke away from the snooker. It was a bank holiday. 14 million British people were watching this game. And suddenly it cut away to this dramatic footage of SAS men in balaclava helmets abseiling down the outside of a burning building and throwing bombs inside and then attacking it. And I had never seen anything quite so exciting in my life. I think it's one of the reasons I became a journalist, was I'd never realized that news could be quite so extraordinary. For British people, the Iranian Embassy siege holds a particular symbolic resonance. It's the story of Thatcherism, it's the story of the SAS, it's the story of sort of counter-terrorist operations. So I've always wanted to do it. And when I wrote a book some years ago about the SAS, the SAS authorized me to have access to their archive, and I wrote the wartime history of the SAS. At that time, I said to the SAS guys, I said, I'd really love to write about the embassy siege. And they said, never going to happen. They said, there is no way you're ever going to have access to these people because it's still so contentious. But 8 years later, they relented. And one of the reasons I've been able to write this book really was because the Ministry of Defence here in the UK gave formal permission for the surviving soldiers who had taken part in the final assault of the SAS on this building to speak to me. And so therefore I've been able to kind of pull together, I hope, a kind of demythologized account of what really happened.
Now, you did get access, but I know just reading through some of the sources and stuff in the back that you still had to change some names, and there were still, it seemed like some things where they're like, it's off limits, Ben, you stay away from this.
Yeah, one or two things. I mean, funnily enough, that comes more, I think, from modesty on the part of the SAS people who were involved than any kind of national security issue. they don't want to seem to be bragging, but on the other hand, they would like their story to be told. It's the old problem with special forces people is that they love the mystique of what they do. They want it to be secret. On the other hand, they love to tell you their stories if they get the opportunity. So it's, I think that's less to do with sort of there being any secrets that they don't want out. One or two bits I had to be a little careful about. Some of what happened at the Iranian Embassy siege is still current capability, as they call it. Some of the things that they did then, they would do now. And I agreed to keep those out of the record because who wants to make it easier for terrorists? I have no desire to do that. So yeah, the one or two bits I had to be a little bit careful about. But this is 40 years now. This was an age before mobile telephony. This was an age before, listening devices operated the way they do today. It's a quite different story. So the technology has moved on massively.
Now, is this still something that most UK people know? Because I'm a history nerd, and I vaguely knew about this happening, but I had really no background in it. I couldn't have told you much about it. How well known is this right now in the UK if you stop somebody on the street?
If you're over 55, you know this story, or you think you know this story. You certainly have a kind of folk memory for it. If you're under 55, it may mean very little to you, indeed. I mean, it was such a critical moment for Thatcherite Britain in the 1980s. And it has a very, very important long-term significance. It did dramatically affect the world we live in now. But as an event, if you are under 55, you probably don't know about it. You may have seen the images. Your father almost certainly told you about it because it was so deeply buried in our kind of national kind of self-image. For Americans, it has a particular significance because, of course, it was taking place at precisely the same moment, and indeed partly as an echo of the hostage situation, the hostage crisis situation in Tehran. We are talking about post-revolutionary Iran. In 1979, as I'm sure most of your listeners will know, the Iranian Revolution took place, the Shah was swept from power, and a hardline fundamentalist Islamic regime came into power, which is still in power. In 1980, it was still a very young government. And this incident really does take place at the same time as the American embassy in Tehran is being besieged. There were still 55 hostages inside and will continue to be besieged for a long time afterwards. 6 days before the attack on the Iranian embassy in London took place, America had attempted to liberate those hostages in a disastrous and failed special forces operation codenamed Eagle Claw, which had ended in disaster. It hadn't worked. It had humiliated Carter. His presidency never really recovered from it. And it was a debacle. That event hangs over this one. And in many ways, this was a sort of riposte to that. On the other hand, it is also a very different situation because the morning that it happened, just to sort of refresh or to tell your listeners what happened, on an April morning in 1986, heavily armed Arab gunmen broke into the Iranian embassy in London and took hostage 26 people. And they held them hostage for the next 6 days. These were Arab protesters, really, who were opposed to the Ayatollah's regime. They were not Islamic fundamentalists. Many people think they were, but they weren't. They'd actually chosen to carry out this operation in Britain because they believed that the British were also opposed to the Ayatollah and would give them a fair hearing. They did it because they had supported the revolution, most Arabs, the Arab minority in Iran. But then instead of getting the political rights that they wanted from the new regime, they had been brutally suppressed. And many people were killed in southwest Iran, the oil-rich region. And that had deeply radicalized a sort of Arab minority there, of which these 6 were the most militant. So they thought they were fighting a blow against the Ayatollah. What makes the whole story in a way very tragic is that in reality they were being manipulated. The person behind this story, the person who really was behind this plot was Saddam Hussein, who, along with Abu Nidal, the brutal terrorist mastermind, had come up with this plot as a way to undermine and destabilize Iran. So really what was happening was the initial skirmish in the Iran-Iraq war, which would erupt later that year in 1980, was fought out on the streets of London. This was a battle in essence between Iraqi Arabs and Iranian Shiite, and it was taking place in Kensington.
What I find amazing about the start of this is you can't say it started out peacefully because poor Trevor Locke, the policeman on duty, kind of took a little bit of wounding to the face. But it started out almost not benevolent, but it wasn't as threatening as you hear other places where it's like people are getting executed right away. It's like these 6 terrorists came in and we're trying to make a point. If we can make our point and get out of here, we're going to try to. It kind of started there, but then started to curdle pretty quickly, right?
Yeah, no, that's very well put, Brendan. I mean, they were an odd kind of terrorists, these people. They were not brutal suicide bombers. They intended to survive this experience. Their plan was to go in, hold hostages, Iranian hostages. They had no idea there were any British or any other people inside it. Hold Iranian hostages, these representatives of the Ayatollah's regime, force the Ayatollah to release Arab prisoners in Iran, at which point they hoped and believed the British would provide a plane, they would release the hostages, and they'd all go home. I mean, it sounds like a very naive expectation now, but actually, in the circumstances of sort of 1970s terrorism, it was not unheard of. I mean, incidents like this had happened before, and the British had a record at times of negotiating with terrorists and allowing them to go free. So they had an expectation that they were naive, partly. They were being manipulated by the Iraqi Mukhabarat, brutal security service of Saddam Hussein. They were being used and they were pawns in a game, but they had reason to believe. So it starts in a kind of quite gentle, reasonably gentle way. And the gunmen are rather astonished at what they've ended up with. They've got far more hostages than they ever wanted. And the whole thing has become sort of complicated. They thought that they would deliver their message, get the prisoners released and go home. In fact, what then transpires is an increasingly tense standoff with the hostages and gunmen inside the building and hostage negotiators outside trying to talk them down and trying to talk them out. You've got the politicians in the emergency committee back in Whitehall who are pressing for a bloodless conclusion to this, but are nonetheless, Thatcher is adamant that these people are not going to get away. They're not going to get out scot-free. So that the negotiators are in some ways in an impossible position. And at the same time, you have the SAS fully tooled up in the next door building, ready to go in and take the place down and liberate the hostages if they possibly can. That's a plan that's been in place for many years, actually. I mean, the British capacity to respond to terrorism had been improving steadily over the previous 8 years. And the SAS always had a group ready on standby. The only problem was they'd never actually been used. So this was the first time that they might conceivably be deployed. So you've got all these different elements contributing to a tense situation that is all taking place. And this is really why I love this story. It's all taking place in one room. The theatre in which this is happening is one large room inside the embassy. And we know what's happening inside there, in part because MI5, the security service, and the police are inserting listening devices into the walls. These sound very antique and rustic by our standards today. At that point, they were cutting edge. These were micro audio probes that were being put in. So the conversations that were taking place inside the embassy were being recorded outside it. And you can actually piece together who was saying what to whom at any given moment. So it really does become a kind of TikTok, if you like, as it sort of moves towards the extraordinarily dramatic climax.
What I love about your books, and this is kind of a perfect example of it, is the story by itself is interesting enough somebody would want to hear this. But you always focus on characters. Yours is always a character study, and the story happens around them. And it felt like, especially for this book, you had so many people to choose from, right? You've got everybody in the embassy between the terrorists and the people who've been taken hostage. SAS, like you said. Then you've got the police and the hostage negotiators. You might have like an actress or two running around looking at stuff. How do you, first of all, decide who makes it in, right? There are some obvious ones. You're going to want the hostages. But how do you decide on the periphery who makes it into the book and whether or not you're going to talk about snooker, whatever it is? How do you decide what's going to kind of get in the book and keep everything moving without losing that, main through line that you got?
Well, I was told something once many years ago by David Cornwall, better known as John le Carré, who was a friend of mine and was incredibly helpful and kind to me over the years. And he once said to me that his method, he said, for keeping the story going was to ensure that there was jeopardy of some sort on every page. Now, that doesn't mean is the bomb going to go off, is he going to live, he's going to die, but you had to persuade the reader to be engaged in the fate of the people whose story you are telling. You have to take them with you. And I'm pretty ruthless about that. I mean, unlike a sort of scholarly historian who would feel that every person had to be involved and everybody has to have their own footnote and it has to be a comprehensive, I'm pretty ruthless. You know, if a character is not taking my story forward, if they're not offering me something new, some new perspective, some other way of taking this to the next page, I'm afraid they don't. I mean, I'll mention them, but they may not make the cut. But you are right. There was almost an embarrassment of riches for this story, because one of the strange things about it, and I suppose it seems strange to a modern reader, is that everybody in 1980 wrote everything down in a way that they don't today. You know, we assume that somehow our every digital fingerprint is being recorded somewhere. It isn't really. But at that time, it was still a paper and pen world. And many people immediately after this dramatic event went back home and wrote it down. And I've managed to find in the course of the research no fewer than 4 written, unpublished accounts by people who were involved. One was the senior policeman. 2 of the hostages wrote their accounts immediately afterwards, never published them. They just wrote them down in order to remember. And one of the SAS people kept a really detailed diary. Now, with that kind of material, you really get access to what people are thinking and doing contemporaneously. And of course, unlike memory, a contemporaneously written diary or account is wonderfully reliable because it's not perfect, but it's a lot better than what we think happened 40 years later, because memory gets contaminated and we get other people's memories start to move in. And so although there have been lots of living witness that I've spoken to, there's also quite a lot of documentary evidence that's never really been looked at. And I love the spread of character. I love that there are so many different sorts of people. I mean, we all like to think that in a moment of stress and difficulty, something as appalling as this, we would all behave in the way that would be creditable, or that we would look back on in a way that would make us feel that we had sort of behaved as well as we could. Well, human beings aren't like that. Human beings behave in all sorts of complicated and unexpected ways. And people who've been highly trained and have been waiting for a moment like this all their lives may fail at the last moment. And people who really didn't want to be never imagined they would be in a circumstance like this, may find themselves with sort of hidden reserves of resilience and kind of courage, for want of a better word, that they never knew they had and didn't really want. I mean, that's the other aspect of it. I mean, my favourite character, you've mentioned him already, is Trevor Locke. He's almost my favourite character. I've got several favourites. But so he's the policeman who happened to be guarding the Iranian embassy on the day that it happened. He was a portly, placid, 41-year-old Bobby, who really wasn't looking for trouble. As he himself said, he joined the police in order to help old ladies across the road. He didn't want to be, he wanted to be a diplomatic protection officer because it was boring. It was quite well paid and nothing happened. And so there he was, sort of standing there, and suddenly he finds himself in the middle of this hostage drama. And what none of the gunmen know is that actually he's got a gun. At that point, British policemen were not armed except for diplomatic protection officers who were allowed to carry a revolver. So underneath his tunic, throughout this 6-day drama, he had a gun, knowing that he might have to use it. I mean, imagine what that sort of stress is like, particularly if you're someone like Trevor Locke, who disapproved of guns. He felt that policemen shouldn't really be carrying them. Now, I'm not going to give away what happens, but that gun plays a very, very important part in the final moments of this story. And Trevor Locke, I mean, I've got to know him very well over the years. I'm delighted he's still around. He's incredibly humble about it. He makes it quite clear that he not only doesn't consider himself any kind of hero, he really never, ever wanted to be in this situation and wishes that it had never happened. He's not some sort of plastic black and white hero, because actually the world doesn't produce those, and I don't think they really exist outside Hollywood.
I will say Trevor is the first instance of gastrointestinal heroism, which we're not going to explain. I'm going to let the readers get to it, but I want to put that in the reader's head so when they get there, they'll know what's happening. You got to talk to Trevor. You got to talk to a lot of different sources, and the SAS are one thing. But for people who were really close to this, that it was traumatic for, I'm always interested in, as you interviewing somebody about something that they may not want to return to. How do you handle that? Is it something you ask a question, if you get pushback, you just back away and you just let it go? Or is it you kind of let them talk and you just take from them what you get?
It's often very difficult. You're right. I mean, particularly in stories like this that were very traumatizing for the people. They may either not want to revisit them, or they may not wish to have their versions challenged. That's also a slightly complicated moment. As I said earlier, memory works in strange ways. Families often have their own very closely held ideas of what happened in the past that may well be wrong. So I find myself often in the circumstance of having to say to people who hold very cherished ideas about what happened because they were there, and having to say to them, actually, you're not quite right. It wasn't quite like that. It was like this. And that's always a very tricky situation, because we believe our memories. We believe our memories are truth. But actually, memories are not truth. Memories are what the stories that we tell ourselves. Alice Munro once wrote this. They're the narratives that we tell ourselves to make sense of a tangled world. And nothing's more tangled than a hostage situation. And if you can come out of it and your narrative is there in your head as a way of protecting, shifting that is very difficult. I mean, I lost count of the number of people, including very senior SAS people, who would tell me with absolute sincerity that, so for example, one of them said, several of them said to me, at one point a sniper in the front of the building killed one of the terrorists with a headshot. And I said, well, actually, they didn't. That never happened. Then there's a terrible moment where they go, well, how do you know it never happened? And I have to say, well, I've read the forensic report. I know exactly how each of the people in that building died. And they weren't, no sniper. And there's this terrible silence that then takes place and it's not that anyone's lying. It's nothing like that. It's simply that a shared memory becomes a real memory. And if you are a collective who believe one thing. So it's often difficult with living witnesses, and one has to be very sensitive. On the other hand, everybody wants to tell their story. I think that is an absolutely universal urge. We all long to tell our story. We need to tell our stories. It's one of the ways that we get through life. And of course, having written about spies all these years, spies are the most notorious. Spies long to tell their secrets. It's the one thing that they're the most indiscreet people in the world, spies, because they've had to bottle this stuff up for so long that when someone comes along and says, come on, tell me your story, actually it all comes blubbling out in a most fantastic way. So I think that while there is a resistance sometimes to coming clean, particularly if there are difficult and morally questionable things happen, in the end, everybody wants their account to come out, even if they framed it, even if they're unreliable narrators of their own lives. That's half the fun of doing this stuff, Brendan, is that, particularly spies are great fabulists. I mean, they will tell you things just because they love to spin a yarn and try to tease out what really happened from what they want you to think really happened is half the fun of all of this.
All I'm thinking about is your book, Agent Zigzag, where I still don't know what his deal was, but that's a totally other episode.
Well, he's a wonderful person for this particular example, because Eddie Chapman, who was a wartime double agent and crook, I mean, he was a professional criminal, wrote his own memoir after the war about what had happened. And it's a fabulous tissue of lies. I mean, most of it is completely made up and nonsense. But of course, Eddie Chapman had no idea or any suspicion that MI5 would eventually release his files. So when I wrote that book, I was able to take his account on one hand and compare it with the actual contemporaneous account from the intelligence services. And that was half the fun, was sort of confounding Eddie Chapman's own self-mythologizing while it was going on.
Gotta love spies who are great liars. That's how they usually stay alive.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, speaking of things coming out, I didn't realize this. If you say SAS right now, I think the vast majority of people, Americans or British, they know generally what the SAS is. What you write in this book is a lot of people up until this point didn't know what the SAS was. This was almost kind of like, in a macabre way, their coming out party, right?
Yeah. I would say probably in 1980, not 1 in 20 people would have been able to tell you what the SAS. I mean, they would have been aware that there was a kind of elite special forces unit of some sort. But beyond that, very little. And those that did know about the SAS would probably have had quite a complicated view of it, because at this point, the SAS was operating in Northern Ireland. It was involved in some extremely complicated and unpleasant activities in Northern Ireland. They were fighting a brutal undercover war against, the IRA and other terrorists. And it was very difficult. But the SAS was almost completely unknown, and it was under threat of disbandment. I mean, there are people in the regiment today who say to me, if this Iranian embassy siege had ended otherwise, if it had been a disaster, if it had gone wrong, the SAS would probably have been disbanded. We would probably never have heard of the SAS. But what happened was the exact reverse. It suddenly, from having been a shadowy sort of covert special forces unit, it was suddenly thrust into the limelight. And the applications to join the SAS rocketed. I mean, the former Special Forces director, a man called General Peter de la Billière, was being very funny about it. He said, people were turning up at recruiting offices around the country saying, "Give me a machine gun. I want to go off and do what they did at the Iranian Embassy." And in some ways, it was difficult, and still is difficult for the SAS, because it brought them into the light in a way that they never really wanted to be. No longer after the Iranian Embassy siege could they operate in the shadows completely. And that was very useful for a special forces unit to be sort of more or less invisible. They were very, very visible afterwards, and they've been wrestling with it ever since. Really, this sort of tension between being both a very famous unit and trying to be secret. It's quite hard to be a bit secret. It's quite hard. It's like being a bit pregnant. I mean, you're either one thing or you're not. And I think they still wrestle with it. They still wrestle with their own mystique, much of it based on this particular event, and their own desire for mystery. So mystery and mystique become sort of entwined together, really.
Now, on the other side of the tactics, what do you think about the state of negotiating tactics around this time and how it all kind of worked out here?
Well, again, I found absolutely fascinating, something I knew nothing about at all. Margaret Thatcher had been in power at this point for less than a year. She was not firmly in place. She hadn't become the Iron Lady. She was dealing with a really difficult situation in Northern Ireland. There were backbench revolts going on. And in some ways, the SAS embassy siege was the making of her. I mean, its success became a sort of leitmotif for her, for the Iron Lady. This was the woman who was never going to give in to terrorism. But it was really touch and go. And right from the beginning, she had made a decision that she was not going to accede to these gunmen's demands. Her instructions to the police were absolutely clear. She said, you can negotiate with them, you can offer them food, you can offer them cigarettes, you can give them publicity, you can let them, eventually they were allowed to read their statement on the BBC. But she said, not only can we not arrange to release the political prisoners in Iran that they want to be released, they're not going to be leaving this country. They've committed a crime on British soil, they'll be tried on British soil, which was fine, but it left the police negotiators with very little to negotiate with. There was no give and take to be done here. And so in a way, I find myself really feeling for the police negotiators who were really doing their best to avoid this thing ending in an appalling conflagration. But there was a limit to what they could do. There was a limit to how much they could get there. And that, in a way, is one of the things that really you feel it ticking through the book, is the tension is rising as it becomes more and more apparent to these gunmen, who are not stupid. I mean, certainly the two leaders. The leader was university educated. He was a clever man. He began to realize that he'd got himself into a situation that was going to end in violence, that he had a choice between abject surrender, which he was never going to do, and bloodshed. And there's a horrible moment when you realize that he has realized that. In a sort of odd way, this is a conversation between an Arab gunman and Margaret Thatcher. There's a strange hidden dialogue going on invisibly between those two people.
And we won't go into exactly how it ends, the details or anything like that, but as you're reading it and you make it palpable, you keep feeling every page, I know that this ends in an SAS operation, so we know something's going down, but every page it feels like there's always a chance this ends peacefully. It's like watching a movie about somebody where like the hero dies at the end and you keep saying, oh, we are so close to everything turning out okay for the most part. Could you see that? Like, when you look back at this, is there any way it ends differently?
Truly, yes. I mean, I had such an interesting conversation with Professor John Gunn, who was the psychiatrist who was brought in by the police to advise them on what was going on, to give them a sort of psychological insight. And he believes, and I actually agree with him, that if only they could have kept the conversation going for another 24 hours, if only they could have kept Tawfiq talking on that telephone for a bit longer, he might just have gone, okay, enough already. If he wanted Arab ambassadors to be brought to talk to them, to act as interlocutors, and the British didn't want that, I think that was an error on their part. I think if they had allowed the Syrian ambassador to come along and talk on the telephone and just calm him down, that might have made a difference. I mean, this is how fate works. Had it not been that one of the gunmen had found a magic marker pen in a cupboard and began drawing anti-Ayatollah slogans on the wall, provoking a confrontation with one of the more radical Islamic diplomats who was in the building. Had he not found that pen, there might not have been that confrontation. Had there not been that confrontation, possibly the thing would have ended differently. That's how fate works. He just happened to open a cupboard and there was a pen. History is not something that is inevitable at all. We often look back on it as if something was always going to follow something else. Well, that's not how it works. Fate and accident and boredom and all the funny things that we know in daily life affect the past too. And that is undoubtedly true of this situation. I think it could have ended otherwise, in which case, we'd probably never have heard of the SAS. Thatcher might not have been in power for as long as she was, in the way that she was. Her attitude towards Irish terrorism might have been different. This certainly framed her attitudes towards that. There are whole sets of things. I mean, we're getting into what if history, which is almost always who cares history. But it's but it's fascinating. I think it could have ended in a different way, and it came very close to doing so.
If I can magically give you access to anyone from the book that you weren't able to talk to, who would it be?
Well, can I have two?
You can have two. Go for it.
I'd love to have talked specifically to Thatcher about this event. I'd love to know what she really thought about it, because she covered it up slightly afterwards. She glossed over what it had really felt like. I think it must have been, in some ways, absolutely terrifying for her, because they had told her there's a 40% casualty chance if we go ahead with this plan. If we try and attack this embassy, there's a good likelihood that 40% of the people inside it will end up as casualties. That would have ended her premiership. I mean, the stakes were incredibly high, notwithstanding the kind of humane element of it. I mean, she knew that lives were, she wasn't, she was a human being. Actually. She knew that people were going to die, and it was on her watch. And that, I'd love to talk to her about that. And the other person, I think, is Tawfiq al-Rashidi, the lead gunman. This multilingual, clever, brutalized, depressed, complicated, romantic brute in some ways. I would love to have spoken to him and found out what he was really like, whether he regretted the minute he'd walked through the front door of that Iranian embassy. He was a complicated figure. He's not a cardboard villain in the way. I'm not justifying his actions in any way. He was a man of violence, but he had experienced some terrible things. His own brother had been tortured and murdered by the Ayatollah's security services. As we know only too well from the current history of the Middle East, the best and quickest way to make a man kill is to kill the thing that he loves.
Now, Ben, generally speaking, at the very end of the podcast, I ask authors, why should non-history people read this? It just doesn't fit this conversation because we've talked about. Here's my question. How is this not a major Hollywood movie yet? I don't understand. Before we got on the phone, I was talking to producer Mike, and I said, he likes history, he doesn't love history. It's why he's the perfect producer, because he's just like, this is interesting. You're a dork here. Stop it. But this, I told him, and he immediately was like, this needs to be a movie. I'd watch this movie in like 10 seconds. How is it not? Or are you currently talking to people about how to cast this thing right now?
Well, funnily enough, I am. And it's wonderfully, it will be, I hope, a 6-part TV dramatization. And the wonderful thing about that is that we can do it in slow burn, because the beauty of this story is about the conversations and the still moments, as well as the kinetic moments. It's not a kind of wham, bam, you've got 90 minutes to kind of do the whole thing. We can actually, because of course that's the thing that fascinates me, Brendan, is the relationships, it's the personalities, it's the characters. This isn't a good and evil kind of wham, bam, thank you, ma'am, the villains lose and the goodies win. It's much more complicated and much more interesting than that. So I hope with 6 hours, and there's an absolutely brilliant screenwriter who is doing it. I can't at this moment tell you who that is, but your listeners will, I guarantee, have watched his brilliant productions in the past. He's writing it at the moment, and he's really got his teeth into how this is in some ways. I mean, you ask why is it not for historians? I mean, the answer is that it's really about you and me. It's about ordinary people. It's about what would you do if on a wet Monday morning you happened to be caught up in a situation like this? How would you respond? Because we all like to think that we'd respond in particular ways, but we can't be sure of that. And you never know. I mean, Trevor Locke never intended to be the person that he emerged from this story as. How do you know what you're going to be? And so I suppose what I hope the book asks is, what would you do? Which of this multiple personality story, where would you have found your... It's a question no one can really answer until it happens. But that's, I hope, that in a way, I think is what history ought to do. It ought to ask you to step into shoes that may be of a very different era and a very different sort. But nonetheless, we're all humans, and we all behave in ways that are both predictable and totally unpredictable. And that's down to character. You can't train for that.
Now, Ben, I know I can usually set my watch by you about when a book is going to come out. Do you already have your next topic picked? Are you like 75% done? Can you tell us what it's going to be? What do we expect next?
I am deep into the next one, and I am just loving it. I can tell you a little bit about it. It's another Cold War spy story, but it's quite different, and it's in a quite different arena from anything I've done before. And it's a psychological thriller, really. It's incredibly exciting, but it is also highly significant. I mean, I sometimes say this, which is that, intelligence is a funny old business, because most of the time it doesn't make any difference to anything. I mean, most of the time we're spying on them and they're spying on us, and it ends up in zero sum. Just occasionally, Operation Mincemeat is a good example. Double Cross is another one. Gordievsky is another one. Occasionally it does make a strategic difference to the way the world works and the way history evolves. This story I'm working on at the moment, even though nobody has ever heard of it, is really important to the world we live in today, and it wouldn't be the same without this particular story. So it's great fun. I sort of feel I'm moving into new territory now, and it's great fun.
All right, last question. I want to put you on the spot. Do you promise to come back in the podcast to talk about the next one?
I promise, absolutely. You have my word of honor. I'll be back, and I can't wait. It's been great fun.
Ben, thank you so much for coming on. It was an honor.
A pleasure. Thank you so much.
And that's it for this episode. Ben, thank you so much for coming on. The Siege, trust me, people, get it as a gift for people. Read it yourself. It's awesome. Hit us up Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Don't forget the YouTube channel. Send us emails. Let us know how we're doing. Appreciate you listening. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.
History Nerds United.